Hey everyone, thanks so much for checking out this content on the Hillview YouTube channel. My name's Martin.
My name is Scott.
We're two of the pastors at the church, and it's our joy to welcome you to this time. We would love it if you're able to come and join us in person. If you'd like to do that, there's some contact details at the end of the video for how you can get in touch, and we'd love to connect you up in that way.
But we also understand that maybe you don't feel that you're able to join us in person yet. And so we do hope that this video is a blessing to you, that you find out a bit of what's happening in the church and you're able to study God's Word with us. We also understand that some people have been joining us from further afield, and we would love it if you could be part of a local fellowship, a local church, and we would love to help you with that as well. And so if we can, please get in touch with us. But it's great to have you here with us.
Yeah, so we're just praying that you will be blessed and helped by this content, and that Jesus will be glorified through this video. So take care. God bless.
I wonder what crosses your mind if I say the phrase, the good old days. The good old days. I wonder if any of you have thought about that in recent days or weeks. It really has to be preceded by a sort of longing, doesn't it? The good old days. I guess for many of us, there's actually probably a bit of an eye roll that comes when we hear that phrase, because it is a bit of a cliche, isn't it? Pondering back on the good old days, and we can probably use that idea to kind of poke fun at those who are maybe a little idealistic, or maybe look back with rose-tinted spectacles at the past. But I actually think for many of us, there can be a tendency to look back on previous seasons with a wistfulness and a certain sense of longing and pining for what used to be. So with Bethany having recently gone off to uni, we're glad that she's here with us today as a family. It's been a great weekend, but I've been doing some thinking about the good old days in this moment that we're in as a family. And I don't primarily mean different seasons of parenting, like the good old days when my daughter didn't abandon me and head off to university and leave me heartbroken and bereft. But no, in this adventure that she's beginning, Lindsay and I have been thinking about the good old days of student life and all the ups and downs of that. And yes, we have definitely found ourselves repeating on multiple occasions, Bethany, when we went to university, we didn't have this or that or the next thing. And we've definitely been doing that. The good old days, maybe, or maybe not. But that desire to reflect back and compare moments and seasons to what we're currently going through, that's a very natural thing for all of us. We do it in our personal lives, and we also do it in church life, don't we? Even if we don't have personal experience of something, a picture of something can grow in our mind of what things used to be like. And we talk a lot, don't we, about how the landscape of the church has changed in Scotland over the decades. I remember driving through one of the small little villages on the very north coast of Scotland, and there were 3 large church buildings there in this small village, not even a town. And I was just reflecting that, in decades gone by, those 3 buildings would have been the absolute center of the community. And not just in terms of worship life, although certainly that, but also community life, education, social care, recreation. The church would have been at the very heart of it. And in this small little village now, all 3 of those churches had closed down. I'm sure, maybe, I pray, in the surrounding area, perhaps God's church was still present, different, but it had changed. And we can reflect back on the good old days of maybe when the church was at the heart of the community in Scotland. And we can do this with our own story of engagement with the church as well. Maybe you reflect back on the various church communities you've been part of. And sometimes you can look back and definitely can recognize challenges, but maybe sometimes think, it was so good when that happened. My first connection with this church was in 2002, and that was coming out of a tough season for International Baptist Church, as it was at the time. And one of the things that I became so aware of very quickly at that time was how people used to speak of the good old days of IBC, and how often people would speak of the 80s and the 90s, and stories would freely flow of the wonderful moves of God and the bold faith in God that God's people had in IBC in those times, and maybe reflect back on them with a certain wistfulness after what had been a pretty challenging season. Now, I don't want you to mishear me. In one sense, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's good to look back and remember God's faithfulness. We've been doing that actually in our singing today, remembering the Rock of Ages, our faithful God. And we see this in Scripture all the time, the retelling of the story of salvation. God reminds his people, I'm the God who brought you out of Egypt, steadfast in love and faithfulness. And there are a lot of lessons and inspiration we can take when we reflect on the past. But if we're not careful, it can also lead to some discouragement and disappointment. The good old days. We're not there anymore, are we? Friends, this is what God's people were experiencing in our passage today in Haggai chapter 2, the first 5 verses we're looking at. We've seen in chapter 1 some words of challenge and rebuke from God as he dealt with clearly what was a sense of apathy and a complacency in his people. But here it's clear that their need is different. They find themselves in this place of despondency and discouragement, thinking of the good old days, how different things are now, and they need God's help in the midst of that. So let's read. This is God's word. In the 7th month, on the 21st day of the month, the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet. Speak now to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and to all the remnant of the people, and say, who is left among you who saw this house in its former glory? How do you see it now? Is it not as nothing in your eyes? Yet now be strong, O Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, O Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord. Work, for I am with you, declares the Lord of hosts. According to the covenant that I made with you when you came out of Egypt, my spirit remains in your midst. Fear not. Amen. So let's just try and understand this context a little bit. The people are in need of encouragement for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's the difficult early days they are in of a tough project. So again, we've mentioned a couple of times in Haggai, there's this very exact dating. So we know from the very exact mention there in verse 1 that this word from God comes on the 17th of October, 520 BC. And that's almost a month after the work of rebuilding had begun. And we just think about those early days of a big project like that. They can be difficult, can't they? The early days of a big renovation or a big tidy. I was thinking, even if you're just tidying out a room or a garage, it can be carnage and mess before any sense of order comes, right? And the same with a huge big building project. You can work for weeks and weeks and actually not see any progress in that happening. And they were in this tough stage. And there's also another reason why the work might have been particularly difficult in this moment to do with the calendar of God's people. We're going to look at that in just a moment. But the point here is that things were tough and slow and not much progress had been made. Anyone relate to that? We can feel a bit like that, can't we? You know, we've got all this work to do for God. And it's a bit slow. It's a bit tough. We're not seeing as much progress as we would like. You know, many of you know, one of the things I have to do regularly in my role as pastor, one of the pastors, is to apologize for things not moving as fast as they might do. To which a fair response might be, well, it would be good if you didn't have to apologize so much for that. To which I would respond, well, yes, that's true. I'm sorry. And there's this apologizing that comes because there's a sense of, earnestness and excitement that people have for what God is doing. And there's frustration and discouragement when it doesn't come about. And I am often to blame for that, and I'm sorry when that's the case. But there's this tough moment here. And the really significant thing on top of that stated as to the reason for discouragement, it's listed in verse 3. So there's just this tough reality of things are not going as fast as they might. There's the early days of this project, but then there's a very specific reason that they're discouraged, and it's to do with this former glory of the previous temple. Verse 3, who is left among you who saw this house in its former glory? How do you see it now? Is it not as nothing in your eyes? The good old days. People looking back and remembering what it used to be like. They really were special days. It really was a special place. The first temple had been destroyed 67 years before. So some in the midst, not many probably, but some could remember that day. Now, interestingly, to be honest, as I think about that life of the church in Scotland, where in my mind, the church was at the heart of the community. I actually tend to think of the sort of 1950s and 60s in my mind, 67 years ago. Would take us to 1956. And I just want to show you a couple of pictures just to show the state of the church in 1956. So Ian, if we could flash the first one up, that would be brilliant. So this is Church of Scotland membership. And along the bottom there, where it peaks, the axis there says between 1920 and 1960. So look, the peak is almost exactly 67 years ago. The house in its former glory. And friends, the Baptist Union of Scotland is no different. If we can put up the next picture, Ian, thank you. So this one is the BUS, and the scale at the bottom there is 1950 to 1970. So that's about the peak of the BUS membership in 1960, after the Billy Graham missions that there were. It was really the high point of BUS membership across the UK. Now, just to say it's interesting, isn't it? 67 years before, there we are. Now, is that the good old days? Well, in one sense, yes. But for the people here, we think about what they were looking back to. If they knew what was about to come in the temple of God 67 years before, if they knew what was coming at that point, they wouldn't have maybe thought it was going to be such an amazing moment. And same in that graph, I wonder the people who were at the very top of the peak, if they knew what was going to come over the coming decades. But here our point is that the people Haggai were speaking to were heartbroken as they remembered how things used to be. And it was incredible. We just need to ponder this. Why were they so heartbroken? It was a remarkable place, the temple of God. Listen to the preparations King David made for his son, Solomon, to build the temple. So I'm reading from 1 Chronicles chapter 22. I invite you to turn to some of these passages because it's just incredible what you read here. 1 Chronicles 22, verse 2. David commanded to gather together the resident aliens who were in the land of Israel. And he set stone cutters to prepare dressed stones for building the house of God. David also provided great quantities of iron for nails, for the doors of the gates, and for clamps, as well as bronze in quantities beyond weighing, and cedar timbers without number. For the Sidonians and Tyrians brought great quantities of cedar to David. For David said, Solomon my son is young and inexperienced, and the house that is to be built for the Lord must be exceedingly magnificent, of fame and glory throughout all lands. I will therefore make preparation for it. So David prepared materials in great quantity before his death. And then if you jump down, cast your eye down to verse 14 of 1 Chronicles 22. This is now David speaking to his son Solomon. And it says, with great pains I have provided for the house of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold. Now that's nearly 4,000 tons of gold that were prepared. So I found some images online, which, Ian, I wonder if you could flash up. So this first one is what 10 tons of gold looks like in a room. So imagine 400 rooms like that was the amount of gold that was used in the first temple of God. Or another way to look at it, this is the maximum load a truck can carry on the next photo. Thanks, Ian. And that's 25 tons of gold. So think of 160 of those trucks. This is the amount of gold that was to be used on the first temple of God. I mean, the former glory of this temple was absolutely incredible. Let's keep reading verse 14. So what is it? 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, and bronze and iron beyond weighing, for there is so much of it. Timber and stone too I have provided. To these you must add, you have an abundance of workmen, stone cutters, masons, carpenters, and all kinds of craftsmen without number, skilled in working in gold, silver, bronze, and iron. Arise and work. The Lord is with you. We can also think of later passages tell us that there were all sorts of beautiful precious stones that were used in the adornment of the temple of God. So you think about just the incredible materials that were used. But again, that was only a picture pointing to something infinitely more wonderful, the deeper reality of what was to happen in this temple of God. So many passages that we could have read which speak of the spiritual significance of what was going on, and how the exquisite care and attention of the building of the temple of God was to be directly related to the degree of glory that God received as his people met together and worshipped him. If you wanted to read 2 Chronicles chapters 5 to 7, you read of the amazing spiritual context of the dedication of this temple. There was this worship and celebration. There was this reverence and awe and sacrifice. It speaks of the glory and splendor of God's presence and power in the midst of it, all speaking to the wonder of who God was and is. And Solomon in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 1, he prays to dedicate this temple. And listen to what it says, 2 Chronicles 7, verse 1. As soon as Solomon finished his prayer of the dedication of the temple, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple, and the priests could not enter the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. When all the people of Israel saw the fire come down and the glory of the Lord on the temple, they bowed down with their faces to the ground on the pavement and worshipped and gave thanks to the Lord, saying, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. So this truly was an incredible thing that God had ordained, planned for his people to know and to build and to meet him in. So you can see why Haggai would say to the people, Haggai chapter 2, verse 3, how do you see this now before you, this rebuilding project that is going on? Is it not as nothing in your eyes compared to the former glory of what was there before? They were gutted as they looked on at the state of things, at the state of their condition in terms of their relationship with God, and they needed encouragement from God. And encouragement comes from God. And really, the command of God in this passage is mainly this little word, 4-letter word in our language, the second part of verse 4 of Haggai chapter 2, where it says, work. That's what was needed to happen. You know, it's a mess. What is before you is a mess. Get on with it. Get on with this work of rebuilding. Now that is what is needed today, right? There is rebuilding being that is required across the Church of Jesus Christ. And it's incredible, actually, how now people are understanding that Scotland is a place where maybe one time missionaries were sent from Scotland to the rest of the world, and now the world is realizing that we need missionaries. We need that work of rebuilding. God's work does need to be done. Now, you know how God works, right? He works through his church. He works through you and through me. Of course, God breaks in miraculous powers, but his work happens through his body here on his earth. And we may also be in that place of discouragement and disappointment when we think about some of the hard realities of life in the church of Jesus Christ in this day. And the message for us is, get to work. Now, I don't know about you. I wonder how that can land on you. That can land a little heavily, right? If you're in the place of being fired up for Jesus, then it probably spurs you on. But if, as is sometimes the case for all of us, if you're feeling low, if you're feeling discouraged, if you're heartbroken, if you're struggling, a call to get to work can seem uncaring or even could feel cruel. Friends, our God is not uncaring or cruel. What's amazing in this passage is how this call to work is framed. There is rebuilding to be done. But what a God we have. Listen to how he calls us to work. First thing, as you work, rest. Rest. One of the reasons, I said I was going to mention God's calendar, one of the reasons this would have been a tough first month of rebuilding was because of the major religious festivals that were happening in this time. So over this first month of rebuilding, they would have had their normal Sabbath rest days. No work was allowed to be done on those days. But also, on the first day of this particular month was the Feast of Trumpets. No work was to be done on the Feast of Trumpets. On the 10th day of this month of working was the Day of Atonement. No work was to be done on the 10th day of Atonement. And then on the 15th day of the month began the Feast of Booths. And no work was to be done for a week. They were to go and live in these leafy tents, remembering God's protection and provision for them as they wandered through the wilderness. So, we've got this first month of rebuilding, and there's all these times when they couldn't do any work. They had to rest. Now, here's the fascinating thing. The Feast of Booths was to end on the 22nd day of the month. And that was to be, according to Leviticus 23, that was to be a day of solemn rest. Did you see when Haggai's message comes to the people? Verse 1, in the 7th month, on the 21st day of the month. So, the 21st day of the month, this call from God, work, comes to his people. And then the 22nd day is to be a day of solemn rest. Don't you love it? This is our God. Yes, there's work to be done, but hey, the first thing, the most important thing, I want you to rest in me. What a God. As you work, rest. Secondly, as you work, worship. And that's what these feast days were all about. That's what these solemn rests were all about. It was about coming back to God. It was about putting God and his salvation story at the very center of their lives. Friend, what is God saying to us in all of this? Yes, there is work to be done. There is no question of that. There is rebuilding to be done. But if it's only landing as burden or stress or angst or chore, something is very, very wrong. The context of the call to work here in Haggai chapter 2 is, as you work, rest in me. As you work, don't forget to worship me. Don't forget to honor me. Don't forget to give your lives and your offerings to me. Hillview Community Church, may we never let anything get in the way of that, of our rest in God and our worship of God. Third encouragement from this passage. As you work, be strong. This is not a subtle point in this passage, is it? In verse chapter 4, 3 times, twice kind of underlined by declares the Lord. Again, we see this in Haggai, and here we do, comes this command to be strong. Or better put, less a command than an invitation. It's an invitation. Because we can't be strong in ourselves. as we see, yes, we're to be strong, but God is inviting us into that place. Despite the encouragements around about us, there is this call for us to be strong in Him. The discouragement, I was just reflecting, one thing worth pondering about Haggai, do you know that Haggai's recorded ministry only lasted 3 months? We have these 3 months mention of his life here and in Ezra chapters 5 and 6, I think. That's all we know from these exact dates. Over millennia of God's work, for 3 months, this little guy, Haggai, pops up. I wonder what happened the rest of his life. We know there were some highs he encountered in the story of God's people, and there were definitely some lows. But it's just interesting, isn't it, to ponder how none of us know how God will use our work into the future and how people will reflect back on it. Haggai probably didn't know that millennia later, we would be reading of his faithfulness to God and God's word through him. And nor probably did the people lugging those trees around and cutting them and preparing them and rebuilding the temple in that day, they didn't know that we would be reflecting on this. And nor do we really know. We don't really know, are we making a lasting difference here? Are we having any impact for Jesus' sake? And in that context, these fears and questions and discouragements can rise up again and again. But this call comes, be strong. And it's an oft-repeated encouragement in the scriptures, isn't it? Apart from God's grace and kindness, again, this could all seem quite heavy. The call in this passage ultimately is be strong and get to work. But in God's kindness, that call to be strong and get to work doesn't come at us like it would in our day-to-day lives in this world, right? We hear so many different ways to try and provoke and encourage activity. One of the guys that I follow on Twitter, or X, as it's now known, is he starts every single day with the same tweet. This is what he writes: "Good morning. Today is going to be a great day. Let's get after it relentlessly." That's what he writes every single day. And I just smile, pondering how many people read that like me and just keep swiping, you know? And these are his encouraging words for the day ahead. There are lots of different motivations to get to work in this world. Be strong and work so that you can get things done. Be strong and work so that you can contribute to society. Be strong and work to produce goods and services for the economy. Be strong and work because it will make you feel good about yourself. Now, some of that can be fine, but it's not how the call of God comes to us. God's call is, let's read verse 4. Be strong, O Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, O Joshua, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord. Work. Why? For I am with you, declares the Lord of hosts. Fourthly, as you work, remember presence. God's presence. This work of rebuilding, this call to be strong and to work, comes in the midst of repeated calls back to God. They had been celebrating this feast of booths, that reminder of God's presence with his people, even in the bleakest of times. And here they were in a different bleak moment, another kind of wilderness. And again, God promises his presence. Be strong, work, for I am with you, declares the Lord of heaven's armies. Verse 5, look at the second part there. It says, God says, my spirit remains in your midst. Fear not. That word remains, my spirit remains in your midst. It's a particular word. It speaks of ongoing action. God's saying, I'm with you. I'm going to be with you. I'll always be with you. And time and again through the scriptures, God's people are reminded of this. Be strong and courageous, for I am with you. You can think of different scriptures that come to mind, right? Even as Jesus sends his disciples out into the world, he encourages them, don't look back to the good old days, so to speak, but step forward. Why? For I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Whatever work we do, Jesus and his glory and his honor must be at the very center of that. How could we want it any other way? How encouraging it is to know that his call to us is work, because I'm with you, because you're in me, because I have wonderful things to do through you. I'm going to be there with you. We're in partnership together. What a God. Now, all this is possible as we come to communion now because of his amazing covenant love. Fifthly, as you work, remember covenant. Verse 4 again. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord. Work, for I am with you, declares the Lord of hosts, according to the covenant that I made with you when you first came out of Egypt. The only reason that there was a people of God at all was because of the covenant that he had made with them. This deep connectedness of relationship, that he was their God and they were his people. And he showed himself again and again and again faithful to his covenant, despite his people, just like today, doing everything possible to push him away and to go their own path. And that's what's being reminded of here in Haggai chapter 2. I'm with you. I'm faithful. I'm not going to give up on you. But this covenant that God points to in Haggai chapter 2 wasn't the end of the story. A new covenant was needed. And God had already been promising it. Some years before, a few decades before, God had said this through the prophet Jeremiah. Listen to this. Jeremiah chapter 31, from verse 31. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. This is what we're celebrating here today. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, know the Lord. That is to say, no longer is this covenant going to be a wholly external reality. Rules to understand and to communicate to one another and then to do. No longer is that to be the case, but they shall all know me, verse 34. From the least of them, they shall know me. From the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. This is what we're celebrating here just now. God is faithful to his promise. How can it be, when you think of the horrific injustices and evil and sin that there is in this world and in my heart and in your heart, how can it be that God would just forgive that and remember it no more? Only through Jesus. Only through his death on the cross and his resurrection. The next time this phrase, new covenant, is used in the Bible is in Luke chapter 22, where it says from verse 19, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. All these realities that we're thinking about today, friends, are tied up in Jesus' death and resurrection. Our rest and worship of God, this call to remember that we are his, that we are to remain in him, it is all rooted, not in whatever capacity I have to hold on and to honor him this week, thank the Lord, but it is rooted in his perfect covenant love. And in that then, the last two words of our passage in Haggai chapter 2, sixthly, as you work, fear not. Fear not, it says. We can trust him. We should not fear, despite any worrying trajectories that the church in this day in our culture is on. We should not be struck and held captive by fear. Perfect love casts out all fear. All fear. The good old days, well, yes, there is so much to be thankful for in what God has done in this land, and what God has done in this church over the decades and over the years. And there's so much that God still has for us to do. There's work to do, dear friends. Rebuilding. And chapter 1, there's a challenge about apathy and complacency, and we need to hear that challenge. Hear the challenges for those who are just gutted, struggling. I need to hear that challenge. I know many of you do as well. God says, yes, keep going. Keep going. There's good stuff ahead. Work. But not just in some horrible, cruel, heavy way. Work because of all these wonderful reasons that we've been reflecting on. Ian, can you put up the last picture? I just want us to ponder this as we come to worship and as we come to respond in communion just now. As we work, dear friends, let us rest in him. Let us make sure that rest and worship of God is absolutely crucial, central to everything we do. Let us be strong in him. Let us remember his presence with us. Let us remember his covenant faithfulness. And as we walk forward, as we work in the rebuilding that he has for us, may we not be fearful, but may we be full of joy and anticipation and expectation of what he's going to do. And grace and kindness for each of us here in the church as that is unfolding. And may we come to him again and again and again and say, God, help us. God, help us do your work. And even use little old me for however long you want to, God. May that be our prayer. So just take some time in quiet just now. The band will come up and we'll have just a wee bit of music. And then I'm going to pray. And then we'll hand out the bread and the juice. And this is our time just to celebrate the new covenant, his presence with us, his goodness to us, his covenant faithfulness. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much that you're here with us by your Spirit. And I just pray that you'd minister to our hearts in this time. As we remember Jesus as you told us to do. As we remember his body given for us. As we remember his blood shed for us on the cross. The very Son of God who offered up his life in perfect, willing submission. Having committed no sin, having done no wrong, not deserving in any way, but offering himself for us as a sacrifice for sin. As we remember the new covenant in his blood that was shed, and as we remember his glorious resurrection victory through which we can now come alive in Jesus. Oh God, as we remember, help us hear this invitation to step forward in your work, in your purposes. God, thank you that you're kind and gentle with us and that you even call us to rest. May this be a time of resting and joy in your presence. In Jesus' name.